Yesterday, I liked a picture on Steve England's profile. He's a naturalist and educator from Bristol. Go check out his profile if you haven't already. And it was a picture of a £5 note under a hedge in some ivy. And he had said what an excellent find it was on his government-sanctioned daily exercise. I'd have to agree. Not a bad day's work. So I said that when I saw the £5 note, it definitely looked like there was a story in there with the Queen under the ivy. And so I was then challenged to write and tell this story. So here it is. This story is called Queen Under the Ivy. Some folks say that spring is not here until the hawthorn flowers. It's called the Mayflower. It's named after the month it blooms in. The Mayflower is considered to be a magical flower. Hawthorn is steeped in folklore, and you only need to Google it to discover that there are many, many stories about the hawthorn hedge. There are many stories of people falling asleep beneath the hawthorn hedge and being transported to magical worlds and fairy realms. So the hawthorn's often been associated with that. This is the story of the Queen under the ivy, and that ivy was growing around the hawthorn hedge. One evening, a man called England had set out for his daily walk. He was walking back through some woodland and back through along the fields, and the sun was beginning to set. Now this man, he was used to adventure, he was used to the untamed places and the wild, but he'd yet to meet any fairy folk. That was all to change this evening. As he was heading back through the woodland, he came out into the expanse of a field, and there was a long hawthorn hedge along the edge of that field. As he was walking along, he could see in the distance where the sun was setting and starting to seep into the horizon. He could see two official-looking people. They'd come to ensure that people were adhering to the curfew. People must be home by the time it was dark during this time. England, he thought, actually, I'd quite like to just watch the sunset. Just this once. And then I'll hurry home. And so, in order to avoid the officials, he moved into a small part of the hawthorn hedge where he was hidden. The hawthorn pulled at his jacket and his clothes, but he managed to get himself into the hedge and hidden well enough from the officials. The problem was the ivy was pulling at the cleats in his shoes, and it was threatening to trip him up, and it wouldn't be a very dignified exit from the hedge. So he was trying to unravel the ivy from the cleats in his shoes, when as he looked down he saw many tiny people. He couldn't believe what he was looking at. These had to be the fairy folk. It had to be the Queen under the hedge. He looked a little closer, and there she was in all her ethereal glory, with a tiny golden crown, and she looked up with him and spoke to him in a voice that was as sweet as honey. And she said, "England, come dance with us, sing, entertain us with stories of your travels, and we will reward you well." Well, how could you refuse an invitation like that? And so he did. He found himself in this beautiful palace with tables full of the most wonderful food, anything you could possibly imagine. He found himself dancing to the fairy music as he told them his tales of his adventures. Soon, the night had got the better of him. He had danced until his feet burned, and all he wanted to do was sleep. So that's what he did. he laid his head down on one of the plush velvet cushions that were around the edge of the palace, and he slept while the fairies, they danced on. He was awoken by the shrill trill of a jenny wren in the hedge, the dew on his face, and what's this? A sniffing Labrador licking him awake. As he moved the sleep out of his eyes, he looked up, and there was the Labrador and its owner behind him. And his owner looked down at him. He said, "You all right, mate?" And England looked up and said, "Yes, I must have fallen asleep." And he stood up and brushed himself off. "Have the officials gone?" he said. "What officials?" he said. "The ones that enforce the curfew," said England. "The ones that tell us we can only go out for a certain amount of time." "Oh, those," said the man. "Haven't been any of those since 2020, he said. 2020, said England. "What do you mean?" "How long have you been asleep, lad?" He said, "This is 2030. "Oh, no," says England. And now he knew what had happened, for he had eaten the fairy food, and he had drunk the fairy wine, and he had danced with the fairies and listened to their music, and that can mean only one thing. It means, of course, that you are transported to their world, and that 1 minute in their world can be a decade in ours. And so a decade had passed since England had been gone. Well, the old man went on his way, concerned for England, but England had assured him he knew where he lived and he was going to go home. But before he left the hedge, he looked down, and there at his feet was a crisp £5 note, and on it was written, "For your trouble." The fairy queen had rewarded him, the queen under the ivy. Well, England, he hurried home, and he was very pleased to find his house right where he left it, thankfully, and not occupied by anybody else. He went in and he immediately phoned his relatives, for he knew that they would be concerned about him. They were very pleased to hear from him. They were absolutely astounded at his story, would not believe him. Or did they? Because from that moment on, England was always known as the man who'd been a bit away with the fairies. There you go. And that's my story of the Queen Under the Ivy. I hope you enjoyed that one, Steve. If anybody else fancies a story, if you've got an interesting photo for me, give it, ping it to me, send me a message, and I'll see if I can create you a story. Okay? Toodle pip.